Tessa, thank you so much for joining us, and we are so grateful that you could be here with us.
No, it's good to be here. The 2024 election is important, so the more we talk about it and the more we get out information and get discussion, the better.
I suppose, I think I've asked you this question before, and I'm going to ask you again now on the record. What keeps you awake at night when it comes to these elections?
So there's a real practical answer to this. Last year, Afrobarometer put out a survey that said 72% of people surveyed said that, and this is South Africans, said that they would prefer development and give up the vote if they could have development. And so the idea that we are losing faith in our democracy and democracy as a concept keeps me up at night. That 72% of people who would give up the right to vote so they could have a better life means that people are not seeing a better life as part of the democratic dividend and part of what comes out of a democracy. And so we're far beyond the point where people are disillusioned by one political party or this politician or that politician. We are starting to lose faith in the entire idea of democracy. And I think that's a way more dangerous thing for us than just being upset about what different politicians are doing or not doing. And that's not because the way things are perfect or democracy has produced just perfect systems. But democracy at its core is about our ability to govern ourselves. And I think that we mustn't lose sight of how important it is to have everybody in a society feel like we have the power to do something.
I was going to ask, should we believe in these elections? But I think you've touched on that we actually should believe in elections as part of our democratic freedom. But what I want to know from you is, in terms of educating the general voter, whose responsibility is it? And have we done a good enough job as the different stakeholders to educate our voters, to educate people on the ground to understand their democratic rights?
Yeah, I think it's broader than voter education that is needed in our society, right? Because democracy, of course, is more than voting in elections. In fact, the 5 minutes every 5 years that we spend voting is a very, very small slice of the bigger democratic project. And so, what we need is voter education as part of a bigger civic education that says to us, what are our rights? What are our responsibilities? What power do we have? How does the system work? And I think the elections is a good test ground for that because so many of us get to participate when it comes to elections. Millions of people can cast a vote. We all can have a say in one way or the other, and there's a system and process that we can understand. And so it's a good snapshot of learning about the system and the processes that we are participating in. And so the responsibility lies with all of us in real fairness, right? We can say, well, the IEC has a mandate for voter education as part of its work, and that's legislated by law, but also needs budgets to do that. So that budget needs to come from us, from the taxpayers' money and from the fiscus. And the IEC has traditionally told us it's not had enough funding to do the kind of civic education that it would like to do comprehensive civic education, even comprehensive voter education. And in this election, where we're seeing changes to the voting system, it's more important now than ever that you have the kind of resources required for mass voter education. I remember talking to people who were activists, in the lead up to the 1994 election, and how all of the activists that I spoke to said that one of the biggest components of the success of that election was not the right to vote. People knew they had the right to vote, but how you vote was the determinant about whether people would show up or not. Knowing whether they needed to be registered or not, knowing what the process looked like, what the ballot would look like, what casting a vote means. That's what people needed to understand. It's all good and well to know that you have a right to do something, but the how is important. And I think the IEC is important for that. But in the 94 elections, it was political parties and civil society organizations that did the hard yards. You had even the unions participating in voter education amongst working people. You had civil society organizations working in communities with community formations, with street committees, with sports clubs, etc., and etc. And you had political parties who had a lot invested in the idea that people should know how to vote, right? And I think we've all kind of lost our way when it comes to that. We've all made it the responsibility of the IEC. Even the media, the public broadcaster over the years has waned in its voter education. Somebody was lamenting some shows that were actually particularly about voter education in, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that just don't exist anymore. And so we must all take responsibility for the fact that our democracy is in our hands. The IEC slogan, I think, is one of the best this year than I've seen before. It's your democracy, own it. It's our responsibility to make sure we know and understand the process, and that we participate as fully and as consciously as possible, as intentionally as possible, so that the democracy doesn't just kind of unravel in front of us, but that we are actually governing ourselves even through the process of voting.
Let's get to the actual process, the systems that you've been talking about, and the changes which we will see now in these elections. I believe it was 2019, 2018, I can't remember, but I can't remember the exact year. The New Nation movement wins a very landmark judgment in the Constitutional Court. And then it becomes a domino effect and trickles down to what we have now. Can you explain to me what happened in that judgment, and how does it affect what we will see on the 29th of May?
Yeah, so the New Nation movement, a civic organization, a community-based social movement actually, based in the Eastern Cape predominantly, had for years before the judgment been lobbying for a different kind of electoral system. And I'm often in pains to remind people that the electoral system we have now was set up almost as an interim system. Actually, it is called the interim electoral system, because we got an electoral system that was decided in a hurry, in 1994. There was about a year between the time that Chris Hani was assassinated and the first democratic election, and that is not a coincidence. Chris Hani's assassination triggered a sense that the negotiations needed to go faster because you didn't want to create unrest in the country. And so it was only in about November in 1993 where the actual election was kind of put into motion. So you're looking at a very short time frame to decide on an electoral process. And so one of the negotiations was about what kind of electoral process would be easy, convenient, quick, and fair, so it could be credible, right? And so, especially for smaller, or for parties that regarded themselves as representative of minority groups in the country, said that the thing that they would prefer is a proportional representative system, a system where you vote for parties and parties share the pie and then send representatives from their parties to go to parliament. And the reason that was seen as important was you didn't want the new South Africa to just obliterate smaller groupings of people. And at that point, they were thinking particularly along racial lines, right? So you can imagine that at the end of apartheid, white Afrikaners may look at each other and look at the numbers and think, if we do a first past the post system, will we ever get seats? And so it was that kind of process that led us to having the kind of system we have now. But in 1999, a speech by Nelson Mandela reminded Parliament, I think it was his exit speech from Parliament, reminded Parliament that there's a need to re-look at the electoral system. That was a system that was done for that moment. But is that the system that will carry our democracy into the future, where we only vote for parties? And so the New Nation movement kind of picked up that mantle, because in the early 2000s, we had the Van Zyl-Slabbert report that was done that also showed that we could have a different kind of system that was still proportional, but allowed for independent candidates, allowed for individuals, and allowed for direct voting for at least half of the seats in Parliament. So the New Nation movement enters the fray and says, how do we get to a system where you don't have to be part of a political party in order to be elected into Parliament? And their contention was that, number one, parties had become too powerful. And so a party, because the party has a closed list system and they decide, within their own party, who's going to go to Parliament, the electorate only votes for the party, but I'm not necessarily a party member just because I voted for a party. So how do I know that party is going to listen to me after we have voted? How do I know that if one of the members of Parliament that's part of that party does something bad, that the party will do something about it? But what if I don't agree with the party and what it does? I mean, we've seen a political party recall 2 presidents, right, without the voters being involved at all. And so what they were signaling is that the parties have too much power. and that the voters don't get as much accountability because we can't engage with the parties and with our representatives directly unless we go through the parties in between elections. And so they said we need a mechanism that opens the system up. And so they had gone through a number of different court challenges that they had tried, but focusing on independent candidates became the key one that they won. And what the judgment basically said was that an independent candidate is unconstitutional to prohibit them from contesting just because they're not part of a political party. And that was based on the fact that, number one, we've got freedom of association. And so the freedom to associate also means that you can choose not to associate. But now you had an electoral system that was forcing you to associate. I often say to people, we lament often that we have too many political parties, right? But if an independent candidate wanted to contest in the past, the only thing they could do was start a party, right? Or join a party amongst parties they may not care for, or they may not agree with, or they may not think works. So this gave an avenue and opportunity, number one, for people to associate or not associate, but still be able to be contestants in an election. But also for us to think about how we get more direct access to our MPs. And so the court agreed that you should give independent candidates and people who want to vote for an individual the opportunity to do so. So that's how that was the starting point. And that has now had ripple effects into this election, because what the Constitutional Court said is they give Parliament 2 years from 2020 to 2022 to come up with a new electoral act or an amendment to the electoral act. And now we have a new system where for the first time in 2024, both independent candidates and political parties will be able to contest in the same election for national and provincial elections, but also importantly on the same ballots. And that's where one of the big changes are.
But we've talked about this long ballot. We've talked about, I think for quite a number of months, people were talking about this exaggerated long ballot. But what we found out is there's going to be actually 3 ballots that we will have to put our X's on. Explain to me what these ballots mean and why should they be important? What is the 3rd ballot all about?
Yeah, so in the past, when we went to national and provincial elections, we all would have 2 ballots, right? So you would have a national ballot, and that ballot would have political parties that are contesting at a national level, and all of us across the country would have the same ballot with exactly the same participants on that ballot, right? The same political parties on the same ballot. And then each province would have a ballot as well for parties who only want to contest in that province or want to contest in multiple provinces. But each province would have its own ballot, essentially. But at the end of the day, when you were standing in the booth, you had 2 ballots, and both of them only had parties on them. And you would select your party for provincial, and that would fill the provincial legislature, and you would select your party for national, and that will determine the seats for MPs. Now what we have is 3 ballots. So the first ballot is a national ballot that remains exactly the same as it was before. On that ballot, you would have parties. We have now just about over 50 parties that will be on the national ballot, and that ballot will be the same for everybody, but it will only be political parties on that national ballot. Where the difference lies is that national ballot now is only for 200 of the 400 seats in Parliament. So the parties that are on there are contesting to fill 200 seats. The second half of Parliament, the other 200 seats, will be on what we call the regional to national ballot, or the regional ballot. The regional ballot will be different from province to province, but those ballots will be to fill the other 200 seats in Parliament. So thinking about it as your province is sending representatives from your province into Parliament. That's literally what that ballot is. So it will be different for each province. Not every party or every independent candidate will be on all of the province ballots, but on that ballot, different from the national to national ballot, you will have parties and you will have individuals that are independent candidates. So there are about 16 independent candidates in the entirety of the election. So they will appear in different ballots depending on where they're contesting. But on that ballot, what people need to know is they're looking out for both parties and their logos and individuals and their names and their pictures and their faces. What's going to be important also to understand is that a party on that ballot is contesting the individual with their party list. So we've been talking about lists in the last few weeks because the IEC has now released the party lists. And that just means that on the national ballot, the regional ballot, and the provincial ballot, when you see a party represented there, you see the ANC, the UDM, that party is representing a list of people that they are putting forward to the electorate to say, these are the people who will go to parliament if we get seats, right? And so that party has got that list that is backed up, that is backing up their space on the ballot. So the regional ballot, what you will have is parties and individuals, right? And they're contesting for 200 seats in national parliament. The third ballot is the provincial ballot. The provincial ballot is to fill up the provinces, the provincial legislatures, and that ballot will also have individuals and parties contesting for all of the seats in each province. So it will look similar to the regional ballot, but it won't be for half the seats, it will be for all of the seats at provincial level.
Okay. Now, I just thought of this question, and one person might ask this, is what is the difference between National Assembly and the NCOP? And how does this relate to these ballots?
Yeah. So the NCOP is a body that is formed from representatives from provinces, from the provincial side of it, from the provincial legislature, that get sent almost into parliament in a separate structure. Okay. So it's not part of the 400. So the NCOP is representatives from provinces that then go in. But what you need to think about is that with the regional ballot, right? The regional ballot is not there so much to fill the NCOP.
Okay.
It's there to make sure that the 400 seats in parliament are actually made up of people from different provinces. So if you didn't have people coming from different provinces, then you might have a situation where all 400 seats are taken up by people from Gauteng and the Western Cape, for example, which is not proportional in our system. So the NCOP makes sure that you have people from different provinces that make up the structure that is the real representation of different provinces in parliament, which is just a separate entity of parliament, but you still have the National Assembly, and the regional list just makes sure that you have a spread of MPs from all over the country, not just MPs from the most populous provinces, for example.
Let's go back to the matter of independence. And one might say that, or ask, what is the relevance of independence in parliament? Because you'll find that they are one issue based individuals, or they've got one issue agendas, and that they could be overpowered by these political parties with, for instance, the ANC, who could potentially have over 200 MPs, and that whatever agenda that they are coming to parliament to fight for, they could end up actually not doing anything in those 5 years. They can't be in all of the committees, obviously. So why should I care about an independent going into these elections?
So for the same reason you care about any party going into an election, right? Is that you want representation. Now, our system is not a winner-takes-all system, right? There are electoral processes in the world where the person who gets the most votes, or the party that gets the most votes, gets all the power. We don't have a system like that on purpose. So remember, I spoke about when we started our electoral thinking right at the beginning, we were thinking about how do we make sure that even small groups of people are represented and have a voice. So independent candidates are no different to parties who get one seat in parliament. You might say, well, the ATM has I think had 2 seats in parliament.
But punched above its weight.
But punched above its weight in that it said to itself, what is my role? What is the role of an MP in parliament? And that's, for me, one of the important things about this election we must ask, is what is the role of an MP? Is the role of the MP just to fill up numbers so that a political party boss can, instruct it what to do? No, that's not what an MP does. An MP is there to, number one, hold the executive to account. So even if you're an individual, you can be that one individual that raises, hey, here is a anomaly or a problem or a fraud issue within the Department of Justice. Let's look at that thing, bring attention to that thing. MPs have the power to do that. They have the ability to do that. Or an MP can look at a law and say, this law is unjust. And even if they're one person, they can convince bigger parties that actually there's an unjust law here that we can do something about. An MP can bring a bill, a private member's bill, into parliament again and lobby society, lobby other parties in order to focus on that bill. What's important for me is that each and every MP, regardless of whether they're in a party or not, that's their work. Their work is there to bring forward issues and to convince other members of parliament to agree with them. And so I don't think it's a waste to have an individual there. Every individual brings different skill sets, brings different issues, but most importantly, represents different people in society. And that's really what you want a parliament to be, representative. I think the reason why you've seen a clamoring in society, and really it is a clamoring, when you have over 500 political parties registered, over 1,000 independents participated in the local government elections. When you have that, there's a clamoring in society to know who they're voting for. My father's 80 years old, and he didn't vote in the local government elections. And I asked him why, and he said, because I don't know these people. I don't know who they are. I don't know where to go and find them. We have a system in parliament called a constituency-based engagement system, right? So each parliamentarian gets constituency days, a constituency office, and a constituency allowance. What does that mean? They must go out into society and engage us as constituents. Most political parties only have their MPs use that for party activities. So they don't come and engage us as constituents, as voters, even though there are more voters that are not in parties than those who are. I mean, the ANC and the EFF are great examples of this. At any time in the past, the ANC's had between 700,000 and 1.2 million party members, but they've needed 10 million votes in the last election. So we have more voters than we have party acolytes, which means all of those MPs must actually be focused on all of us as voters, not only people in their parties. And so you must have that sense that an MP is there to represent constituents broadly, or a particular group of constituents, and an independent candidate can do that. A small party can do that, especially issue-based. If the issue I care about is the basic income grant, and there's a basic income grant party, which there is in this election, then I might feel better represented by somebody who's going in there, who I know that's their clear agenda, what they're going to fight for. If I want to talk about basic income, I know which MP to call, because I know that's the person who will take the issue up. That's the way we should have the relationship with all of the parliament, not only with small parties and independents. We must take back the right to access all MPs, regardless of whether they're in parties.
Now, I want to talk about the new entrants, and perhaps you could educate us a lot more on this. We saw Musi Maimane, the Bosa leader, when he was at the gates of the IEC, and he was very impassionately speaking about the 140 signatures that he had to submit. What exactly is this signature process with the IEC? And just give us an idea of what we're looking at.
Sure. So all new parties, and by new parties, we mean parties not represented in parliament or in legislatures right now. So parties who would be new to parliament or new to provinces, provincial legislatures, needed to collect a certain number of signatures in order to qualify for the election, to be on the ballot. Now, this is one of the outcomes of the law that Parliament passed. So parliamentarians were asked to come up with a law that includes independent candidates, and they took the opportunity to not only set a way for independent candidates to contest, but to set a parameter or a bar or criteria for who can contest and who can't, and included in other parties in that. So what they did essentially is they said, as people who are already in parliament, we won't set a criteria for ourselves to be on the next ballot, but we will set a criteria for independents coming in or parties that are not in parliament yet, and they need to go and get more signatures than we needed to get before. Because every party to register needs to get 1,000 signatures, ID numbers from registered voters, right? So all of those parties already in parliament needed to do that. But what the law now requires is over and above those 1,000 signatures, and this is for unrepresented political parties, right? Over and above those 1,000 signatures, you now needed to get 15% of the number of votes it would take to get a seat in parliament in signatures before you could actually contest. And that's for every province and for national. Long story short, that comes up, if you're going to contest in all provinces and the National Assembly, it comes up to about 60,000 signatures that a party that is not in parliament or in the legislature would need to get. So the parties that are in parliament only needed to get 1,000 signatures. New parties are now needing to get 60,000 signatures in order to get there. While they're campaigning, while they're trying to set up structures, while they're doing all of those other things that everyone has to do, in order to contest in this election, they're needing to do that. They need to get extra signatures. Now, last year, a constitutional court judgment in December ruled that independent candidates don't have to get that amount of signatures, because the judgment basically showed that it's unconstitutional and unfair to ask them to do so. They're one person. I mean, if you think of a party's machinery versus an individual, you're asking the individual to do what a party, the parties in parliament didn't even want to do it. Otherwise, they would have said they're also going to do it, because they know it's cumbersome. It's a difficult task, right? I'm almost going to say that it's easier to get votes than signatures.
Yeah.
Because when you have to go for a signature, you have to ask somebody for their name. You have to ask them for their ID number in South Africa, where people are really worried about being scammed and all of that, and Popia. And then you have to ask them for their signature. And they also have to be registered voters. So collecting all of that requires resources, time, and trust that everybody may not be able to get right.
We just spoke about trust, the trust deficit within the country in terms of our elections.
Absolutely. But the logic was that you needed to have some sort of bar. My concern is that that bar should be equal for everyone. That the people in parliament and the people outside of parliament should all have to get that. But where we are now is that parties are having to get these signatures, or have had to get these signatures. And now we know who's going to be on the ballot based on who submitted all of their signatures, paid their deposit, put in their candidate list, etc. But what Musi was really lamenting was, he was saying, how do we know that those other guys could have gotten those signatures in parliament? That really, we need to, as we go forward, rethink this idea that it's different rules for different parties going into the elections.
So you've spoken about an IEC, an electoral commission, which is under-resourced, incapacitated. How does this work in terms of these signatures? How do you verify these signatures? What is the IEC saying about its own processes in terms of where it's been put now due to this bill which was passed in Parliament?
Yeah, so the IEC had, number one, waited for the electoral or the constitutional court judgment in December, and then in January told parties and independent candidates what the rules were for signatures, because that judgment didn't include the parties. It only applied to the independent candidates, saying you only need to do the 1,000 signatures. That being said, that means there's a time issue that it has. The elections are time limited. They don't decide the election, the president does. And so they've had to go into a process that, how do they, manage this in a short period of time? So the thing that we know the IEC has done is they have verified that every person who has signed is a registered voter, is a legitimate person, is not dead, all of those things. We know that they have verified that part of it. Whether they have verified each and every signature, we don't know that. The IEC has not given us any sense of what a process is for that. However, if we feel like there may be a need to know and understand that, we should ask the IEC, especially if there are claims. And, election seasons are very dangerous for conspiracies. So if there are claims or thoughts that, somebody didn't follow the process or didn't get the signatures that they needed, then take that to the IEC with evidence to say, we think that this needs to be looked into and investigated. But at this point, we don't know the full extent of the full process of verification, but we do know that the IEC has, in their system of uploading and all of that, has got copies of all of the signatures in terms of all of the forms. Every party had to submit each of those forms so that you could see that the actual signatures existed there. and they ask parties to put in the individual ID numbers into a system to verify the ID numbers, that they're correct, that they're real, that they're not dead people, and that they're registered voters.
Now, before you take us through to the processes that will unfold before we get to the voting day, um, there's been a lot of question. I mean, there's a political party which has gone as far as asking other world leaders, other world powers to come in and observe our elections for fear that these elections may or may not be credible. Your point of view on the credibility of the IEC's processes itself, and given that we've already touched on its advantages, its disadvantages, in that it lacks the resources it needs, is the IEC operating or managing a credible process? Should we trust this process? And I think that's a very important question.
Absolutely. So when I spoke about the IEC's resource constraints, the IEC often is very clear that its resource constraints is on the voter education side because it pumps so much of its resources into the logistics of the election, into the process of the election, which it regards as necessary to make sure that the election can be credible. So having kind of been at the IEC result centers twice now for all my sins, what the IEC shows you is how transparent the system is all the way through. It shows you how we've made sure in our elections that people's ballots are actually secret. But we've also made sure that party agents are allowed from different parties to be in the room when counting is happening, to be in the room while voting is happening, to ensure that there is a check and a balance from the side of the parties participating, so that if there's anything that seems like it's not correct or unlawful or anything that's happening that's against the code of conduct, they can then say something about it. But also over the years, from 94 in fact, we've always had voter observation. We have had a voter observation from large international and multinational organizations, and we've also had local observation missions. Local observation missions, unfortunately, have been fewer over time. On the one hand, it's because South Africans have trusted the IEC process, which I think, because we've had 6 national elections now, where we've not had, major court battles about the outcome of the results, and we've trusted the credibility. We have seen fewer local missions, but I think local missions are really, really important. I think South Africans ourselves, as voters, must invest ourselves in making sure that we are eyes and ears as well. So, I use the phrase, the turkeys don't always vote for Christmas, that chicken, it doesn't want to be on the... So leaving it to the political parties alone is not good enough. I think we do need more voter observation missions that are local, locally based, locally funded, locally resourced, and have local people, ourselves, participating in that, so that we can be an extra set of eyes and ears on the ground during the elections in voting stations. But the credibility of the process is in that it's a manual process. I know a lot of people are saying we need electronic voting. I don't think we're ready, guys. I don't think we're ready to trust that something won't be hacked or we just, even if it won't happen.
Load shedding, glitches.
we won't, I don't think we're at the point where we can trust it, right? But the manual nature of the process means there's a count and a recount and actual physical ballots. And when there's an issue, you can actually go to the physical ballots, and the physical ballots are there in order to give people comfort that their question or their query has been seen to. We also have electoral courts. And electoral courts are special courts that are very important for an election's credibility. So that if a party or if a voter even feels like something is wrong, they can go to the court for the court to be the arbiter of the process and make sure if there's anything that's happened that's illegal, it can be processed. Or if you have an issue with the IEC. So right now we've seen parties that are going to the electoral court to take the IEC up. So a party had been removed from the candidates list. So the IEC says they did not submit regional lists. They are now taking that to the electoral court. That's the right thing to do, so that we can make sure that whenever we have a query, number one, there's evidence. And this is what I appeal to everybody. If a party says we are being done wrong in this election, there's a party going to the election for a candidate being removed. If you feel you've been done wrong, number one, have evidence. and number two, be willing to take that evidence to court so it's publicly available. Any party that's not willing to do that is creating conspiracies, to be quite honest. It's really important that we do that because the credibility of the election is in the transparency and the openness of the process. And I don't think to this point we have had issues with the IEC. What we do need to watch out for in this election is not so much whether the process will fail, but whether or not we as voters know enough to make sure that we show up, we are not turned away for technical reasons, that we vote in the right places because of the ballots. Like one of the big changes to this election, for example, from the IEC side, is that this is the first national provincial election where you must vote at the voting station that you are registered at. Now, this is something we don't talk about enough because in previous elections, at a national level, you could vote at any voting station in the country, right? Because the ballot was the same everywhere. Or you could vote at any voting station in your province because the ballot in your province would be the same everywhere. Now, those rules no longer apply. The IEC, for logistical reasons, is saying that they would like to know that the right number of ballots is going to the voting stations. So they would like us to go and vote at the station that we're registered in so that a voting station doesn't run out of ballots because more people came here and didn't go there, etc., etc.
So wait, are you saying that because what happened, I remember in the last elections, 2019, I voted because I was registered in the Eastern Cape. So I did not necessarily vote for the provincial elections, but I voted for the national elections here in Johannesburg.
Correct.
So are you saying that I won't be able to do that?
Yes. So if you are registered in the Eastern Cape in East London, right, and a voting station in your community, and you are now in Gauteng for the election, you will not be able to vote on any ballots. That's how it works. So it doesn't matter, even if you are in the Eastern Cape, but you are not at the right voting station that you're registered at. So it's important that every voter, number one, checks your registration. Know where your actual voting station is located physically, and know whether or not you're going to be close to that voting station on the 29th of May in order to go there. Otherwise, you might stand in a queue for 2 hours and then or even stand for 5 minutes. I haven't stood in a voting queue for 2 hours. So even stand for 5 minutes and find that you are 100 kilometers away from your actual voting station. That will cause less people to vote, which is not good for our elections. This election is going to be decided on voter turnout. So it's important that we know that if you are not going to be at your voting station, by the 22nd of May, you must inform the IEC formally. So a week before the election, by then, you must inform them formally you will not be at your voting station and where you will be, because they're trying to manage logistics. And so the rules that used to apply, this is actually more for people who have voted before, do not apply now. You must go to your actual voting station.
Now, I see we're running out of time, but just if you could just briefly take us through, because we've been going through a verification period now. I see parties and independents. There are certain people who are appealing. What exactly is the process from here onwards? What are we going to be seeing with the IEC?
So the IEC, by the 12th of April, wants to finalize the list of parties that are going to be on the ballot and independent candidates that will be on the ballot, so that they can start drawing up the ballot, so that we can start seeing what the actual ballot looks like, where the position is of each party on the ballot. So there is a process that they do where they call it the signing of the code of conduct ceremony, where they'll call all the political parties together to actually one by one sign the code of conduct, but also where they will do almost a raffle to see which party will be at the top of the ballot, and then everything else will fall alphabetically after that. So that process will happen, and then we will have a ballot. Thereafter, we'll go into just campaigning season, and where you will have parties being able to now canvass for votes in the different areas, knowing where they'll be on the ballot, knowing where they'll be contesting. We'll know that.
So we get to see the ballots before we actually get into the ballot box.
So the IEC will show what a sample ballot will look like, so that we have sight of that, so that you're not surprised on the day about where things are and all of that. But you also have the candidates list will be out, it will be finalized, so you'll know which candidates each party will be putting forward, you'll know which independent candidates are there. And it's our job as voters, not only the party's job to come to us, but it's our job to look at the manifestos of each party, to look at each candidate, to ask the questions about who these candidates are, why they are there, etc. And then you'll have special votes that will happen. So special votes will happen on the day before elections. If you need a special vote, either because of illness, because of work, anything like that, you have to apply for a special vote as well. And then we'll have the process of the day the last day for if you moved, and then we'll have a vote. So those are the big dates in the run-up.
My last question to you is, and I suppose I think you're actually the right person to ask this question. What do I need to look for? Because a lot of people are confused. A lot of people, like myself, do not know who they're going to vote for. What should I be looking for in terms of the individuals, but also the political parties to vote for in these elections? What do I need to know about these political parties before entering into that ballot?
What we need to understand about this election is that voters are the most important participants in an election. There is no real election without people who vote, right? And so we focus a lot on political parties and what they bring to the table. But I think as voters, we need to have conversations with ourselves, reflective conversations, and conversations with each other about showing up in this election. In the last few elections, fewer and fewer of us have shown up. And I think we need to start talking to each other about showing up, the importance of showing up. Political parties know this, but we don't. But voting is a group sport. It is a group assignment. It is a group activity. And if you've ever been in a group assignment at school, you don't have your group there and then you just say, peace guys, see you on the day that we submit. You don't allow somebody to not submit their part of the assignment and without question. Yet we allow each other to not show up for a very important thing. Your vote will affect my life. Your lack of voting will affect my life. We must start having conversations voter to voter in this country about why it's important to vote and then how we're making our voting choices, right? So at the Ronia Circle, we're doing something called voter conversations. And we really ask communities to do two things. To have conversations about what's on the ballot. And by that we mean, what are the issues that you care about enough that you are willing to vote for on the ballot? So before looking at the manifestos and what they have to offer, ask yourself, what do I care about? If I care about education, then I must look for parties that care about education. And only those parties must get my vote. Only the parties that care about the things I care about should be the ones that I vote for. And I think we don't spend enough time talking about the issues. And this election also needs to be about the issues. The issues must matter. The people can come and go, but the issues that they represent must matter. And the second thing is who is on the ballot. To actually know these people. We fixate a lot about who's going to be the president and the ministers. But in fact, we are voting in 400 parliamentarians and hundreds of MPLs that are going to represent us. They're going to be paid by our money to go and sit in parliament. They must go and do work. We must know who they are and what work they intend to do. And I think we must start asking political parties and independent candidates that question. Who are you? Who are your MPs? Who are these people? And what will they be doing for the next 5 years? The other thing to remember, especially in an era where we're talking about coalitions, that any of the 400 people who get a seat in parliament could be president. Any one of them by law could be president. And we've seen it in the city of Joburg. It's no longer theoretical, where a party that got 2 seats in council has had mayors from both of those seats in the Joburg Council, which means any person who we put into parliament or allowed to have a seat in parliament could turn out to be our president. And so it's important that we know every single one of them, that we don't allow political parties to distract us with 1 or 2 faces. They must show us that their entire squad is ready to go.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tessa. Thank you so much for this critical education.
Great. I'm very glad to do this.